First of all, what we're going to do in this example is we're going to find f of g of x. If I write f of g of x as f of g of x, it's much easier to see what our substitution is going to be and where it must be done. In this case, I'm looking at my f function, which is the root of x. And in the f function, where I had an x, I'm going to replace it and I'm going to put all of the expression for g of x. In other words, my answer is going to be the square root of 2x plus 2. Now in the next question, I ask you to find the domain and the range. The range is much easier than the domain because the range depends on the domain. So let's take a look at the domain first. Looking at the graph, which is a function that I've depicted over here, you can see that the x values that I'm allowed to use for my domain start when x is minus 1 and go all the way up to infinity. The y values start when y is 0 and once again go up to infinity. But how did I find these values? When I look for the domain first, I must take a look at my restrictions underneath my root. I must know that that number under my root has got to be a positive number because I cannot find the answer to a square root of a negative number in my real number system. In other words, I said to myself that 2x plus 2 must be greater than or equal to 0. In other words, x had to be greater than or equal to minus 1. How do I find the y values? I find my y values by taking that x value and putting it back into my root. In other words, for the y values, I said that the y values had to go from the square root of 2, starting at my smallest x value, going all the way up to infinity. In other words, the y values that I was allowed to choose started when y was 0 and then went up to infinity. So writing this out now in interval notation, I would have said for my domain that x could have been an element starting when x was minus 1 and going all the way up to infinity. And the range, which I got by looking at the domain, started when y was equal to 0 and went all the way up to infinity. Let's repeat this exercise just so that we can make sure that we're good at it. In this example, I now want to find g of f of x. In other words, I'm looking for g of f of x. And so what I'm going to do now is on my g graph, where I found an x, I'm going to replace it with the whole expression for f of x. And this now is going to be written as 2, the square root of x, plus 2. Let's now take a look at the domain and the range of this graph. Once again, looking first at the domain, remember that your domain is restricted by this number underneath the root. That number for x had to be greater than or equal to 0. So you can see straight away that your domain is going to be from 0 all the way up to infinity. How am I going to find my related y values for the range? Well, if I take my smallest x value, then for y must start at 2, the square root of 0, plus 2. In other words, y's smallest value for the range is going to be 2. So once again, writing this up as interval notation, for my domain, I said that x could start when x was 0 and go all the way up to infinity. For the range, y had to start at 2 and then could use all the other values going up to infinity.